50 million deaths were caused by the Spanish influenza, one of the deadliest epidemics in history. It kills more people in 24 weeks than AIDS did in 24 years. It kills more people in a year than the Black Death did in a century, and more people than World War I did. It was named after Spain, which was neutral at the time of the war, and gave the false impression that it was hit the hardest after King Alfonso XIII had contracted the virus.
The Spanish influenza took effect on 1918, killing approximately 25 million people in 25 weeks. The disease raged until 1919, but it died down on the year of 1920.
The gruesome conditions of World War I, such as unsanitary training camps, caused the influenza pandemic to become much more lethal than it should have been. The horrible and rat-infested trenches were a breeding ground for the virus, and the transportation of sick troops around the world spread the disease.
The influenza is believed to have originated in either France, China, the American Midwest, or the World War I Western Front. The World War I Western Front was the main battlefield of the war that was around Belgium, France, and Germany.
These countries blamed Spain because it was the only country that reported the illness when King Alfonso XIII had contracted it. It gave the false impression that Spain had been hit the hardest.
Historians do not know where this virus may have originated, but they have some interesting theories.
Some historians believe that the pandemic could have originated in France due to previous outbreaks during the 15th and 16th century. Back then it was called the disease of Naples. However, they argue that the transportation of troops around the world could have started and spread the disease.
In Oedipus, France, many soldiers were transported from Britain. Many soldiers that were leaving for battle reported that the returning soldiers were severely ill and wounded. These soldiers were transported from various countries and had contracted the virus.
In addition, 96,000 Chinese laborers were sent to work for British and French lines on the World War I Western Front. Historians said that these laborers were sealed in train cars with limited space and carried the disease.
There is also some evidence that the virus could have originated in China. In 1917, a year before the spread of the influenza pandemic, there was a respiratory disease outbreak in China. A researcher named Christopher Langford showed that China suffered a lower casualty rate from the Spanish influenza than any other nations, which supported that there was some immunity in the population.
Christopher also stated that Chinese officials reported the respiratory illness that struck China in 1917 was very similar, or almost identical, to the Spanish flu. He also found medical records indicating that 3,000 Chinese laborers that were sent to Canada were diagnosed with flu-like symptoms.
There is also some evidence that the Spanish flu could have originated in the United States. Some evidence suggests that 48 soldiers at Camp Funston, Kansas, in March 1918 died ahead of the outbreak.
One historian theorizes that soldiers being trained in unsanitary camps could have formed the disease. As those soldiers were transported across the country in order to be shipped to Europe, they visited many camps and could have spread the disease among other soldiers.
The transportation of soldiers contributed to the spread of the disease. Soldiers were transported in large groups where space was limited, which made the disease even easier to contract. Every country involved shipped workers and soldiers around the world, but there is one place where the disease took off. Most people believe that the World War I Western Front was the breeding ground of the disease.
Historians believe that the horrible trenches and sick soldiers caused the Spanish flu to become even deadlier than it was supposed to. All of the transportation of sick troops and unsanitary trenches caused the disease to spread even more. When soldiers returned for more, many of them were sick and spread the disease to many people in their country.
Many medical researchers and historians are often amazed that the Spanish flu was a very aggressive and fatal virus. Many of its symptoms were often misdiagnosed for diseases such as cholera and typhoid.
The Spanish influenza was a virus that attacked the respiratory system, and it was mainly present in young adult soldiers. The first wave of the virus was mild, but the second wave was more contagious and deadlier. One observer stated, "One of the most striking of the complications was hemorrhage from mucous membranes, especially from the nose, stomach, and intestine. Bleeding from the ears and petechial hemorrhages in the skin also occurred."
Many doctors say that young adults were the largest group to be affected by the disease. The reason is that the disease was strong enough to surge the cytokines that activate the immune system. The immune system then overreacted to the disease and caused a cytokine storm.
The cytokine storm caused body fluids in the immune system to block airways in the lungs, which made it hard for the victim to breathe. Basically, The stronger a person's immune system was, the more vulnerable they were. In addition, the Spanish flu also attacked the lungs and caused pneumonia. Many of the victims died within hours.
Scientists and researchers wanted to see how the virus affected people, so they recreated the 1918 influenza virus and tested it on 7 macaque monkeys. The experiment was supposed to last 21 days, but these poor monkeys only lived up to 8 days before the scientists had to kill them by following laboratory guidelines.
Scientists reported that they had to kill the monkeys because they were in severe pain, had a high fever, and had breathing difficulties. They believe that this is also what happened to the victims of the Spanish flu.
The regular flu always targets small children or the elderly, but not young adults. Scientists also believe since most soldiers and nurses were strong and young, the flu adapted to their strong immune systems and made it robust. The soldiers and nurses infected with the virus were always living in gruesome conditions where the virus thrived, which increased their vulnerability.
In 2008, a group of researchers discovered that a group of 3 genes enabled the virus to weaken a victim's bronchial tubes and lungs and clear the way for bacterial pneumonia. This evidence supports that horrible and gruesome conditions of the war could have caused the virus to become stronger and spread faster.
The Spanish influenza had a harsh impact around the globe. Many have estimated the Spanish flu killed 50 million people, but some say it killed 100 million. The exact number of casualties is not known due to lack of medical records. There are some immune places, such as the country of China and parts of the United States.
Many schools, churches, and theaters across the country were shut down. Various cities in the United States were quarantined. People were ordered to wear masks, to avoid contact, to stay indoors, and to stop spitting. Various funeral parlors were often overwhelmed with dead bodies.
The Spanish influenza also destroyed economies all over the globe. For example, businesses all over the United States were stopped. Basic services such as the postal service and garbage collection were stopped because all the employees were sick. There was a food shortage because not enough people were available to harvest crops.
This disease ended around 1919 through 1920. Many of its victims had either died or gained immunity. There have been recent pandemics, but not as deadly as the Spanish influenza.
The rat-infested trenches of the Western Front, the transportation of contagious troops around the globe, and the cover-up of the virus outbreak were all serious contributors to the Spanish influenza pandemic. The horrible conditions of the war, such as battlefields containing deceased people, was a breeding ground for the virus to thrive. Many troops and workers were transported across the globe and almost all of them contracted the virus, causing it to spread. The countries decided to avoid the outbreak because they were too focused on the war. The Spanish influenza did not only kill 50 million people, but it shattered economies and pretty much ended World War I.